Who's going to introduce?
You are.
All right. So we decided to call this chat gender critical thinking. And I am Mel. I'm a mechanical engineer. Um, and moving on to which one of you wants to go next?
Go next. I'm Anastasia, and I am a network engineer for a fiber and internet company. I'm also a mom of 6. I have a BA in women's studies. 5 of my kids are girls. I do a lot of volunteering with children. So that's kind of the perspective that I come at all of this from.
I'm
Who's
Maud,
next?
and I've been an immunologist most of my life. I'm going into bioinformatics now, so I've got an interest from a feminist point of view as well as a scientific point of view.
And I am Naya, and I am primarily a body worker. I do craniosacral therapy, and so I work with the nervous system and trauma and that kind of thing.
And just to follow up, the background in mechanical engineering is a background in the extreme reaches of male dominated fields and what it's like for women to be on the margins. So I got a kind of indirect education in that regard when it comes to women's issues. So do you want to talk about the reason why we disagree with Exulansic on the topic of complete androgen sensitivity syndrome and why we're making this video?
I think the topic of DSDs or disorders of sexual development in the gender critical world is not particularly very important as such, because when we're deciding what sex someone is, we should look at the general development. And as a sexual species, men and women who can manufacture sperm and eggs and deliver them successfully to the point of fertilization, that is what we should take as representing a male and a female sex as a starting point for gender critical feminism. Bringing disorders of sexual development into the picture is not very helpful. And when you consider sex, it's not as easy as just saying, oh, I spot a man, I spot a woman. There's genetic sex, gonadal sex, which is whether someone has ovaries, testes, street gonads, which are really not functional gonads, and ovotestes, which is an organ that has areas of ovum tissue, ovary tissue, and testicular tissue. And then finally, you have the phenotypic sex, which is not just external, but mostly observed from the outside. And overall, you can also consider psychology to be a phenotype. And we have to consider, what is it about a man that presents a danger to women? What is it that we do not want in the female bathroom? That's what we have to think about. Because as long as there is no danger to us, then we should relax a bit.
Well, I think that what that launches is the fact that this is a nuanced issue with a lot of aspects to it, and we have to deal with it to the extent that we can move past it or put it aside or agree that it's not central to the question of the gender
Yeah.
critical project.
Does
And
someone
so
else want to say that now?
Does somebody want to summarize Exulansic's
Position.
perspective?
I think I can probably do
Yeah,
that.
go ahead.
So
Yeah.
my understanding of Exulansic's position is that essentially is that there needs to be a hard, bright line between male and female, and that because individuals with complete androgen insensitivity are necessarily male genotypically, that because they are male that they should therefore be treated as male, because we need that hard line. So there isn't necessarily there, like, what we're arguing, we can't really argue that they are not male in the way that she says, in terms of like maleness is defined by having a functioning or an SRY gene, a functioning SRY gene. And that's pretty much it. And then the development of the Wolffian structures, so the testes. So because they have the internal testes and the SRY gene, they are male. Therefore, because they are male, since male and female are separate infinities, everything that they like, you can't. She says that it's essentially illogical to say that they have a female phenotype, because since they are male, no matter what their phenotype is, it is a type of male phenotype. So that would kind of put the argument then becomes that they would be in like kind of an edge case evidence of the diversity within maleness, like that, they're like an extremely feminized male essentially, but they're still male, and since they're still male, they should be treated as males with a disability and not as female. I think that's more or less it, but I can, as we go along, I can keep
so
bringing my understanding of her
yeah,
position.
we can move from that into, so we can, like, let's say we can see that they're male, and we can talk about what the implications of that are. If we are, like, if we're saying case people are male, then what does that mean for the laws? Like, should, like, the implications of keeping them out of women's spaces, and what what that would mean for women or for social organization, etc. So I know, Anastasia, you have thoughts on this.
I do. So I follow Exulansic. I haven't for super long, but I've watched, a ton of her videos. I think that she does great work and really important work, documenting, as she calls it, the Church of Trans, but documenting gender ideology and what it's actually doing, and specifically what its consequences are for people, especially children, who are being medically transitioned. So I think that's super important work. I think she does a great job of explaining that in a way that is accessible for a lot of different people. So I'm an Exulansic fan. So I watched this video where I don't know why she really took the turn into talking about intersex, but she did, and presented information, I think, which was mostly accurate, about different conditions. So then CAIS was one of the conditions that she talked about. And I thought, okay, I see the argument that you've made, that because there is a point at which the SRY gene is activated and testes were created, that boom, that means you're male. So that's the point at which males and females diverge, never to be seen again. And I understand from her perspective that argument, and I don't even necessarily disagree with it, although certainly I believe that there are many experts in the field who would say, that's not how sex should be completely determined, is that one differentiation point. That's not really my argument with her. My argument is that then immediately, when a handful of her own fans said, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure I agree with you that because you've defined them as male in this way, that automatically means that they are a threat to us, that they need to be lumped in with all males, and that we need to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to keep them out of our bathroom. Well, it's one thing to get some pushback and some challenging of your ideas, but then immediately she put out this really weird video going, "This is why we can't have nice things, feminists." And I was like, okay. I didn't know that it was other feminists that are responsible for our status in the world at this point. I don't think it's the fault of any women that we're in the trans gook situation that we are right now. There are people in power, both men and women, who have allowed this to happen. And there are people who, we refer to them as TRAs, who are actively seeking not just dignity and privacy and safety and respect for transgender people, which I think none of us disagree they should have, but actively seeking to erode women's rights and erode women's boundaries, and many of them for not great purposes. There certainly are some who have bad reasons, and we all have discussed it. I'm not going to elaborate on that. But to blame us, I thought was a little crazy. But then to really just double down on it and say, we have to all agree. If you don't agree with me, you are wrong about the science, which I don't think is accurate. But if you don't take the position that because the science says they're male, that we have to exclude them from our spaces, I just thought was extreme. And I feel like we are a social justice movement. We are a political movement, but we should be able to interact with one another in a way that we're sharing ideas, debating ideas, learning new things from each other, not saying, well, if you disagree with me, then you're on the other side. And so the place where I really got, and I'm going to let the rest of you all talk, but the place where I really got irritated was when she kind of screen capped something that I had said and said that, this is what they're doing. This is what the TRAs are pushing for. They want, teenage girls to have to undress in front of the whole school or anybody who wants to watch. And I thought, okay, this is insane. I mean, take a nap, because I'm a mom. I have little girls, and I'm on your side. I'm not a trans rights activist. I'm a gender critical feminist, and I'm the mother of little girls. I don't want men in their locker room. But I think Helen Staniland and her Staniland question is so perfect, because it said, she says, are you okay with male born people with penises being allowed to undress in front of young women and girls. No one agrees with that, except for the perverts who want to do that. No one agrees with that. And so if we could just get back to what's really important here, which I think is keeping penis people out of girls' locker rooms, then I think that would be awesome. So that's what got me energized into, hey, I want there to be a rebuttal, because we don't all have to disagree or to agree. And if some of us disagree, that doesn't mean that we're trans rights activists or that we're secretly, in the closet, child molesters who, are just arguing with you because we're promoting men's rights.
I think
Right.
that's
And I think
really good.
and I think that when we consider the situation of rights and how we actually implement this reestablishment of our boundaries that were eroded and in some cases never there, there's a whole question of legality and ethics and practicality. And there is, you reference it being crazy to confound male born people with a penis with like a CAIS person who is born without a penis, whether or not they're male. And
With a
there is
vagina.
this, with a vagina, there is this like you envision trying to spot these people, and
Yeah, I mean, it's just not possible.
you're going to go down, like their doctors don't spot it, they don't spot it. Naya and I had found a paper where they surveyed something like they did medical checkups on and surveyed something like, what's it, how many people with CAIS people? Was it like
I think it
40 or something?
was. Yeah, I don't know.
20,
I thought it was
it
less
was
than that.
20 something maybe. I think it was like 20 something, but almost 50% of them had no idea that they had XY cells. They didn't know their karyotype. They didn't know that, like, they knew they had some sort of health issue, but they had no idea that they were male. And if you can't even spot that you're male, and then you go down this path of trying to encourage other people to spot these people as male in order to keep them out of our spaces, it's a recipe for paranoia.
Right. Well, and at that point, she literally argues that, well, now once you've had a diagnosis, at that point, you know that you're male, and so therefore you need to act as though you're male, and you must stop using the ladies' room immediately. And if you have a hard time adjusting to that, you're just a disabled male, you need to seek therapy, which I thought was pretty extreme. And cruel is the word that's been used a lot. And her response to that is just, well, what do you care about men? I mean, they're male. Why do we care about being cruel to them? And I just felt like I literally can imagine being like a 13 or 14-year-old girl. So you're in junior high and you haven't gotten a period yet. And so you go to the gynecologist and the endocrinologist, and you've done all this stuff and find out that your case, what are you supposed to do? Show up at junior high the next day and go in the boys' locker room? I mean, how does that make sense?
I'm
And the fact that it doesn't make sense means that we have a practical problem with implementing what she's saying. And that some of us recognize that practical problem, doesn't indicate that we're not on the same side with her.
Right. Were you going to say something there?
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of like chime in to maybe like represent the opposing argument a little bit. So I think that along with her argument that sorry, I don't know if you can hear all that background noise. I think along with the argument that they should, as soon as they know, as soon as their condition has been reached, like the diagnosis has been reached, that they should essentially then be categorized as male, because at that point, if they are continuing to utilize female resources, like they're doing it like cognizantly, but what the main issue is that the main issue that she has is that since they are male, there has been it is demonstrated, there's been demonstrated evidence that the SRY gene itself causes a certain, will influence brain development in a certain way that's distinct from if it's not present. So the sum total of maleness includes the SRY gene. She kind of, I think, is a little bit reductive about it. That can you hear that barking? Okay.
It's okay though. Not too loud.
We like dogs. It's fine.
Okay. So I think she's a little reductive about it. That she's sort of, essentially she's hypothesizing in a way that the origin of the male pattern behaviors that we don't like are coming from the SRY gene, and maybe even more than that, she's making sort of the opposite argument that we can't know that it doesn't come from the SRY gene. So that essentially there is no proof that these individuals are not going to be, according to her, there is no proof that these individuals are not going to be violent at the same rates or in the same ways as males typically are. Therefore, we have to cover our bases, and they should be treated as male because they do have a certain amount of male differentiation.
So I think that ties into this idea of the multiple types of phenotypes, and I personally think it's preposterous that, so like the purpose of a behavioral phenotype is to accomplish the goals of the body that it inhabits. And part of the issue with, it's the exact same hormones, the androgens, that masculinize the body, that it's the same vehicle that evolution took to arrive at the male behavioral phenotype as it does the physical phenotype. So the idea that there's a train leaving the station that's headed towards a female phenotype, that, like the external appearance of it, that diverges and at the same time goes down a separate track to become the male behavioral phenotype, is kind of like, it's a duality to me. Like this idea that it can split and traverse two separate things is, I feel like it's nonsense. Like I don't see how it manifests. And even when you take other intersex conditions like congenital adrenal hyperplasia, it's an exposure to androgens that masculinizes a piece of female anatomy, but it doesn't convert it. It's like the hormones bring an attempt to accomplish something, and there isn't another path. Does that make sense? I'm uncertain if I'm saying something that makes sense biologically.
It's almost like sex is complicated.
Yeah, it's almost like that. And I think,
and it is complicated. I don't think the fact that there are two sexes is complicated. I think we all get that there's no third sex, and that people with intersex conditions don't represent some sort of middle ground between two sexes, but trying to make it uncomplicated by saying, well, you may not be able to tell, but I can tell on every individual whether they're male or female. And once that's been identified, then we can keep them separate at all times. I just think that is simplistic and doesn't. It really adds to the confusion that TRAs capitalize on by bringing up intersex conditions. And what I've said is I don't think it's appropriate for intersex to even be part of this discussion. But when TRAs bring it up and say, well, what about intersex? It's easy enough to say, disorders of sex development are not relevant to the fact that you're an adult male with 3 children and you don't belong in the ladies' room, Richard. It's just not that complicated. And trying to, really even, I feel like we're getting sucked into a trap that's been created by trans rights activists. I feel like even bringing it up and trying to go, well, we can always separate and always say, this person for this, whatever, that really plays into their hands because it creates a situation where you're saying, well, this is a male vagina.
Yeah,
Or, well, no, we can't call it a vagina. I mean, it is, though, but we can't call it a vagina. We now have to call it a blind pouch. Like, what? It doesn't.
right, and
But they do have
the
a
thing,
vulva, don't they? They do have a vulva. They may have only the front part of the vagina, but they do have a vulva. And they certainly don't have
yeah,
penis, do they? They certainly don't have
exactly.
a scrotum.
and I think that the fact that when we try, we had talked about how the law factors into this, and if you're trying to carve out, like I'm envisioning a challenge to anybody, regardless of the condition, if there is an XY person who carries a baby to term, trying to exclude that person from a maternity ward is the law would never allow that separation. The law would never be okay with that because there's no way to create another facility for that. So as long as that's possible, and you try to make a legal case for excluding people like that on the basis of them being male and maternity wards being a female place, or separating male and female maternity wards, that is the essence of sexual differentiation. And if you admit men into the category of those who can give birth, even just in terms of like legally speaking, because there's some conditions you would consider male that potentially could give birth with medical assistance. But if
PMDS.
you really do try to make that distinction and separate them out, then that really could strike down the entire de facto scenario of sex segregation, because you would obliterate the ability to distinguish by the need for childbirth protections and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, let me add to that, or hopefully clarify that a little bit. Um, so what you're talking about is really in the United States the Equal Protection Clause. And so equal protection means that the law has to apply equally to all people. And obviously, there are some times that we make exceptions for that. But there are specific categories that if you make exceptions to that based on those categories, you have to have a really, really good reason. And so firstly, legally speaking, there's not a doubt that CAIS individuals today, under United States law, would be female because they would have been identified as female at birth. That's what would be on their birth certificate. So unless they proactively went to a state that allows you to change male or female on your birth certificate, which I think as gender criticals, we should all be arguing that's not allowed, period.
Right.
But, unless they're going to proactively go in a state that allows that and change that marker, they are legally female today already. And you can say, well, they shouldn't be. Okay, but that means you have to change the law. We have some laws that need changing. We have some laws that need to be added. We have some that need to be repealed. Is that the one? Is that the one that we need to rally around and try to change? Is to get CAIS individuals marked as legally male? I don't think there's an argument to be made that that's what's most legally important for us.
And to round it out in terms of motivation and what Naya was saying about the like the SRY gene, and then also this idea of the internal testes, it is, for example, a lot of the traits of case males is, like, for example, their height is actually because they don't have exposure to androgens, that they grow tall for women. They're not tall for men, they're tall for women. And it's precisely because they don't have androgen exposure. And so there's this whole dynamic of um, like how do you justify the separation of them, just logically speaking? You run down the list of social norms and legal norms and all of these things, and the triggers for it, even though they have an SRY gene, don't seem to be there. Like, is there an epidemic of case violence against what would that look like? Like, what would it look like to have, you know, that? And why would nearly all of them are heterosexual in the sense that they are attracted to male partners, and straight men appear to be attracted to them. Lesbian women, in the rare cases that case XY males are, attracted to women, women are attracted to them. And it's this like sticky spot of what triggers that? Like, how would a person who's interested in men, who looks like a woman and is tall for a woman but has like standard strength for women and osteoporosis issues and whatever, how and why would they enact violence against a woman? Like, what would that even look like?
Well, I think you could make the argument, which Exulansic, tries to do, that, well, they could be still dangerous. And without any evidence to the contrary, I mean, I guess you could make that argument. The fact is, there's plenty of evidence that their behaviors match women's behavior, not male, for aggression, for sexual violence,
In
for a host of things that, behaviorally speaking, they appear to be women.
Yeah, in every like analysis and article that I've personally seen, it says that they have a female habitus. Their behaviors are female typical from the very beginning, which doesn't mean, obviously, since male and female are separate universes, it doesn't mean that in of itself doesn't mean that they are female, but it does mean that, in sort of a practical sense, they are much more comparable to females than standard males. I think a lot of people take this argument to kind of be like, well, that's so essentializing of you, because if you're saying that because they have a female brain or female typical behaviors that therefore they are female, then you're saying that you could put everybody in a brain scan and determine their sex that way. But I think that's kind of like a little bit of like of a I think that's sort of a fallacy, like a slippery slope kind of thing.
Well, I think that's a really good point to bring up, because there's that whole argument of, you like, if somebody passes, like if a trans person passes for intersex, or if somebody behaves like a woman or thinks like a woman or feels like a woman, but at the end of the day, intersex is not trans. It is, trans people are trying to be intersex in a way. And on top of that, there's a big difference between, like, we can identify as a society, in laws, in social conventions, everything. We can, and just psychology, we can identify the difference between people who have some sort of disability or have some sort of disorder or difference, and people who try to modify themselves. Like, if somebody if somebody is naturally skinny, that's very different than somebody who is bulimic. If somebody just doesn't eat a lot or has a high metabolism, it's a very different mechanism than somebody who has an eating disorder. Like, it's two entirely separate things, and we can make that distinction. We can make a distinction between somebody who has some sort of developmental difference in their sexual presentation and somebody who has a psychological condition that leads them to want to change their appearance.
And going off of that, I also wanted to just bring in, because something that I've seen a lot being brought into this conversation is what about males who are put on puberty blockers from like a young age? Because in a way, that's not a choice that they're making, but that's something that they're going to have to live with. And so it's because it is happening during a developmental period that essentially it's like a induced, it's almost like an induced disorder of sexual
Intersex.
development.
Yeah, I
That's
think
kind of
that
my
we
argument
should
for drawing a bright line.
not spend our time and energy wondering what to do with those people. And we should spend a lot of time and energy not having any more of those people. And I'm not talking about somebody's gonna clip that part out and go, see, she's a Nazi. Um, there is no excuse under US law or biblical law or the laws of the universe. There is no excuse for what has been done to Jazz Jennings.
Yeah.
And if you happen to watch this, Jazz, we love you, and we can see that you're in pain. And your family is not being supportive, and you know that they're not being supportive because they're causing you more pain. So please find somebody who's not part of your family or not approved by your family to get some therapy and talk about why this is and why you're in pain, because it's hard to watch the suffering that we see you going through.
Yeah.
But there's no excuse for this to have been allowed to happen, and it must stop. Um, and I don't want to divert our time and attention to discussing whether or not Jazz can go to the bathroom with me, which currently legally he obviously can. And let's focus our time and attention on making sure that there are not more Jazzes out there.
Which, and I think, so not only is there the issue that just came up of avoiding extreme body modification for deception purposes, which is one thing. And our society has a whole, all societies have taboos against deception because it makes it hard to live in a society. And that's, like living in the body you were born with is not a deception. Modifying that body or the body of a child to an extreme is a deception. And then there's other issues, health related issues, abuse, neglect type of stuff with modifying children, that I think is worth stopping independently from this question of intersex. But then
I
there's, oh, go ahead.
just going off of the idea of deception, but if you had something, if you wanted to finish out before
I forgot my other thoughts, so you should go
I.
ahead.
Okay. Yeah, there's just something that I kind of wanted to highlight that I found really fascinating about this whole argument, which is that in like calling categorizing males slash women with CAIS as men does something interesting because so it does that based on a particular sort of, it's almost like a mathematical logic reason to say that because they have these certain criteria of sex determination that we obviously should have that sort of like very hard line understanding, because it is true that females with CAIS, they don't have a problem because they're female, so not having androgens doesn't really affect them in a noticeable way, versus males with CAIS obviously develop a totally different phenotype. So, but when it comes to this whole idea of deception, because I think so that kind of does loop into Exulansic's argument about how once they know, they know, and so to continue to portray themselves as female would in and of itself be a deception because they are in fact male. But what I think, well, I think that actually has a level of truth because they are, if they are in fact genotypically male, then they are in fact male. However, I think there's a really important aspect that leaves out, which is what Mel alluded to with the fact that straight men and lesbians do end up in relationships with them. These people can literally live most of their lives, sometimes their entire lives, and not even know. So it's not just like we're not just rehashing that same argument of people who say they're lesbians like me, therefore I'm a woman. It's not a rehash of that. This is actually real. That you can actually live your whole life. Like I was reading an article about how in India it's quite common to not even catch this condition until people are married and trying to have kids, and then they're not fertile and they're wondering why. And I'm not really sure how that happens exactly, but I guess the knowledge isn't there to be on alert for the lack of a period.
Yeah, I don't think that they're taking their 13-year-old daughters to the gynecologist to see why
Yeah,
they
no.
get a
So
period.
so the point here being that their actual physical reality is somewhere in between. Like they actually have a physical reality that is female, and they also have a physical reality that's male. And Mel and I were kind of talking about this in a sense of why intersex people in many cultures are revered. It's because they do truly manifest this kind of gray area, even though sex is binary. Their manifestation does happen to be this sort of gray area, and and even when they do concede that they are genotypically male, and I've been seeking out interviews and seeking out videos to listen to them speak about their own condition. So even when they concede they have XY chromosomes, therefore they were supposed to be a boy or whatever, that doesn't change their physical material reality that they have this female phenotype. So the question of deception, it almost what's happening is that they have this blended existence, and when we take this mathematical reductive approach, this one we're almost essentializing them to genetics. We're essentializing them to their genetics in a way and I've mentioned this a few times, that because I in conversations with her, like we have discussed the other side. What about females who are masculinized to the point of having a male phenotype or a penis or something? And that in a way, this type of reductive argument ends up in the result of making the argument that women can have penises, which is like kind of hilarious, and that men can have vaginas. So it's
No,
almost
we can't call them vaginas though. They have to be called blind
right.
pouches.
Vulvas and
Because
blind pouches, I guess, would be the accurate. But so it's I think it almost demonstrates what happens. Like you have the gender identity kind of religious thinking that essentializes males and females in such a way that you can have a mismatch. This gender identity soul thing that is separate from the body. But almost this approach to viewing biological sex essentializes it in a different way, but it ends up with it crosses the same lines, and you end up with women with penises and men with vaginas. So I just thought that was like very ironic and kind of hilarious.
it is kind of ironic, and I even mentioned it in one of interchange that they just kept saying, but they're male. Case males are male. Case males are male. Case males are male. And I was like, how is that different from trans women are women? It does become almost a religious belief, and it becomes uh, we become heretics if we don't accept that, and if we say, no, I really think that for all intents and purposes, these are women. And that,
Yeah,
that is my opinion. I see how they're male. I see how you got there. But practically speaking, I think they're women. And,
yeah,
if
it's
that
like,
makes me a trans rights activist, then there's something wrong in your logic. The other thing that I'd like to just mention, we've talked a little bit about behavior. We've talked about their material reality. Socialization. They're being treated as girls and women. They're absolutely experiencing misogyny the same way that we do. And they're not being socialized with the sort of, I would just say, entitlement that most men are awash in from birth. So there is a very practical difference in how they are treated, and how the way that they are treated manifests in their experience.
Mhm.
Were you going to say something, Orge?
I was just going to say, it reminds me of um, astroscientists, some of whom think Pluto is a planet, and some of them don't.
Yeah, definitions are not that, it's like, to contrast that, I came across a poem where somebody was saying, like, isn't the earth more of a moon than the moon is a moon to the earth? Like, isn't the earth more of a moon to the moon than the moon is to the earth because it's bigger? And I was like, well, no, because the whole point of a moon is that it rotates around a planet. And then a planet rotates around a star, and it's a very clear organization to the system. And there is no dispute there. But when you have something like Pluto, what is the difference between a planet and an asteroid? That isn't as easy of a question to answer, because that's where it gets into the gray area when it's so far out in the gravitational field and the orbit is erratic or whatever. It's really hard to say where that line gets crossed. And so, unlike the moon scenario where the moon is a moon, the earth is not a moon, like you have to do weird physics to do that. Like the moon analogy is the case of trans, where it's like, no, you're unambiguously a man. There is no instance where the Earth is a moon to the moon. But with Pluto, you are in the territory of who is to say, like, that it's a legitimate thing to debate. Some people think it is, some people think it isn't. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be out there no matter what. We're going to be able to observe it no matter what. It has no consequences to the bigger
Well,
debate.
but if it's a dwarf planet, it's not a planet, and therefore it must be excluded from all classrooms. It's not allowed. Probably presents a danger. I don't know what the danger is.
It could hinder.
I Exulansic has a background in linguistics. So I feel like she knows what she's doing here, and I don't know what the purpose to it is, but semantics are not practicality, and the law is reality in the United States, or really anywhere, but in the United States, we live under the Constitution, we live under federal and state and local laws. And so that's the playing field that you have to make changes in social policies. That's the playing field that we're on. And so when we're talking about wanting to make, just the example that she gave of girls, teenage girls in high school or junior high not having to undress in locker rooms with boys, that's completely valid and very important. And that happens through law. And so law is one of those places that really is about practicalities. And if there's no way practically to identify a case individual as not female, then the law is going to regard them as female, which
And
it
I
already
think,
does.
right, and here I think I wanted to make an important distinction here. There's a difference between deception and privacy. Like, they're very different things. And the example, like my own personal example, is that I know what my father looks like. I know what my grandfather looks like. I have gotten a DNA test. I know that I'm 25% recent African origin. Most people don't know that about me. I am not required, because I know what these ancestors look like. It's kind of crazy to me that I'm not deceiving people by not telling them. I'm just living in my body. I'm doing what I'm doing. And the fact that I am like, I have like a very direct line to recent African ancestry, I have a heritage of slavery in my family. And I think that is like, that's an issue for me. And I'm not obligated to share DNA test results with somebody. I am living a life true to myself, and that's the type of, it's very parallel to the karyotype thing. Like, that you have an XY background and internal testes. Okay, like, that's private information. That isn't deception to fail to disclose that to people. And then there's all of the implications of like, like, if a society cared what my, in a one drop society, if you care what my background is, then you're going to require, it's like you start requiring genetic testing, and you're talking about like, I was in this museum in Europe once that had all of the materials Nazis used to determine Jews from non-Jews. Like, they had all these like skin tone charts, and like, what it was crazy. It was like, that's the territory you're getting into when you start to care about these private things, when you say that this private thing should be public. which is very different from intentionally changing something about you or your children in order to disguise an otherwise obvious fact about them.
That's the reason that we have some of the laws that we do. And that's the reason that in the US, if you want to make any law using race or sex or religion, or any of a number of protected categories, the state has to have a higher level of reason for that. They have to be able to demonstrate that there's a legitimate purpose for it, and that they're using the least restrictive alternative. There's actually 4 criteria. It's called strict scrutiny. You can all Google it. But there's 4 criteria that the state has to meet for a law to be upheld should it be challenged. And I can't see how the state would possibly meet any of those things when it comes to excluding CAIS individuals from female spaces. Which, keeping in mind, that's not a law that we live under today. That males are not allowed into female spaces. By and large, it's totally legal in most places for men to go into the women's room. There are some states where bathroom bills have been introduced and some where bathroom bills have passed. Whether or not bathroom bills are a wise strategy is certainly a topic for discussion. Whether or not they're necessary is a topic for discussion. Mostly men stay out of the women's room because most men are not predators.
Well,
And most men are not getting a sexual thrill out of being in the ladies' room. But also because there's consequences. And not consequences because there's a policeman standing outside the ladies' room, but because there's immediate consequences of women screaming and going, "Get the F out of here." And
yeah.
so we're not going to do that to CAIS individuals, and why should we? But that immediate practical exclusion, that social norm, and that enforcement of that social norm, that's what's getting eroded. And I've used the case of the Wee Spa guy. Clearly not okay. That should not be happening. There should be nobody with their penis out in the women's area, whether there's young girls there or not. Clearly not okay. The problem there was not the reaction of the woman who freaked out and said, "Get him the hell out of here." It was the response. And the response purportedly was based on, well, there's laws that protect transgender, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure what that law is or how it's applied. At any rate, it needs to be gotten rid of, because we need to all go back to being able to yell at men when they're in the ladies' room. And Target needs to go back to saying, yeah, no, we're going to expect men to use the men's room because they're probably young girls that are going to be using the ladies' room, and they need to be safe in there. I don't think that means that you have to have a broad spectrum of laws that say that there are criminal penalties for a man setting foot in a women's restroom. I just don't think that that's necessary to achieve that goal that we have. And creating such a law and making sure to include CAIS individuals as excluded persons in that law is not only extreme, which it is, it serves no purpose, but it absolutely invites an equal protection challenge from a CAIS woman saying, well, you're saying that I'm male, but tell me why, state of, let's say, California, tell me why, state of California, I'm not allowed to use that facility when regardless of sex, I have all the same machinery as these other human beings do, and you're making a law based only on sex. What's your justification for this? And is this the best and only way to achieve the state's purpose here? That will absolutely fail.
And I think like something that keeps coming up for me is this idea, the conjunction of social norms with statistics, because when you look at both bathrooms and sports, I'll focus on bathrooms first. In my area, a local restaurant, um, they changed one of their two female restrooms to an all gender restroom. So the restaurant went from having and like female. The thing too is women's restrooms are already under um, like we have less space. We have the same amount of space as men for their facilities, but men have more actual places for them to go to the bathroom because they have urinals and then they have stalls, and so you can accommodate more men. Women require more time in the bathroom. We're more likely to have children with us. We're more likely to have uh, like menstrual stuff to deal with. We have to sit down, which takes more time. We have to urinate more frequently because of our biology, like our physical spacing and whatever. Like men can accommodate more urine in their abdomens than women can, so we have to pee more often. And so all of these things and more mean that women's restrooms are chronic, like there's lines at women's restrooms, we frequently can't make it into one, etc. And so they changed one of the women's facility to an all gender restroom in order to make sure that people who don't belong in there will not be challenged in there, right? Like that's the merging of the social norm with the law, where there is no law that says that you can't do that, but you do have to have equal accommodations for men and women. So do you guys get what I'm saying? Like you're changing the label on the bathroom and saying, well, women can use that, but it's like, but then you're saying that
Yeah.
women effectively have fewer accommodations. And
Well, and
so
that's one of
what
the
I'm
things that I feel like is misunderstood in a lot of this discussion. I keep being told, but I have the right, but I have the right, but I have the right. Well, unless you have that right under law, having that right doesn't do you a lot of good. And women don't have currently a constitutional right to a separate restroom. We have a constitutional right to equal facilities. Um, so, in the university that I attended, for instance, several of the buildings that were older only had one restroom per floor because there were only men attending there. Well, you don't build buildings that way now because women are allowed to go to college too. And so uh, it doesn't mean that my university had to build uh, female restrooms on every floor. It was fine that they said, okay, there's a men's restroom on this floor. You have to go up here to the women's restroom. Third floor is men's room. Fourth floor is women's restroom again. That's equal. It doesn't. We don't have a right to have a restroom on every floor. There's no federal law that gives us that. It's just equal. That if there
Right.
are facilities provided for males, there must also be facilities provided for females. Now, can a business accomplish that with a gender neutral restroom? Typically,
No.
yeah, they could, they can. I'm glad they don't. Let's not push toward having that, because that ultimately, for all the reasons that you just described, Mel, doesn't bode well for women. That's not a good thing for women.
I mean, I would
Right.
argue
And
that
there,
that makes it unequal. Sorry, go ahead, Mel.
well, so I was just going to point out the statistical side of this, which is that so in both, even if in a disorder of sexual development that allows somebody to make it into a woman's category with sports or a woman's bathroom, etc., the statistics of that are limited. There's a finite number, a finite percentage of individuals who could encroach in women's spaces if we allow even if the ones who tend towards male, even if we said every single intersex condition is allowed in a women's restroom, which I don't agree with that. I'm just saying, even if that was the case, we would still not have the potential of males overriding the all gender restroom. Those situations are completely different. If you have an all gender restroom and women stop feeling comfortable going into the all gender restroom, then now women have a single facility and men have 3 facilities. Whereas if you allow in, if you exclude trans identifying people from the women's restroom if they're male, but you allow in people with disorders of sexual development who do pass or whatever, even if you feel uncomfortable, even if you can somehow spot them, you can somehow identify them, you still will not have entire restrooms overtaken by them, because the odds of you ever being in a restroom with one of these individuals will be slim to none. And so women will functionally have the same exact number of facilities and the same, with sports, even if they could dominate the higher reaches of sports, the chances of any one league and any, like all the feeder leagues, all of the ways that people make it into athletics from a very young age all the way to the top, it's just statistically impossible for all of those to be dominated by somebody with a disorder of sexual development. And there's a question of, I do think there's reason to potentially exclude people with disorders of sexual development from sports if they have what I would consider to be like biological or natural doping capabilities or some other physical advantage that isn't, it's outside the realm of possibility for females who 100% everything that manifests as sex, women don't have access to that. But even if we concede that, even if we allow it, it doesn't pose the same risk as an entire male basketball team deciding to play for the female in the league. It's
Mhm.
just complete. It's just categorically different. It's a completely different level of risk to women's spaces. Were you going to say something, Naya?
Yeah, I just this is kind of speaking to what Anastasia was saying, and I've heard this argument online in this debate is that essentially the fact is that there is currently no legislation that explicitly forbids men from going into women's like bathrooms and women's, well, I mean, I think like we're only really talking about bathrooms here, but I almost think in some circumstances like prisons is maybe even more compelling. I mean, prisons is a situation where you're really stuck with them, and women's facilities are physically designed very differently from men's facilities. So if a man is in a women's prison, they have far more access to women in a vulnerable state. Plus, they're more likely to be criminals. So anyway, but what I'm saying is that the argument that I've heard is that because because men, because there isn't this precedence, but now since this medical stuff is coming onto the scene where people are able to participate in this deception that wasn't possible before, now we are in a point where we are in a need for some sort of legislation or something. It's the argument that I've heard. And I mean, we've already sort of floated around some different ideas about how we could protect women's spaces essentially. But I think that is a valid question to say that, okay, well, yeah, all of that was fine in the past, but we didn't really have this issue. Now we have this issue. We have to draw the bright line. The line has to be at sex, and CAIS individuals have a male sex, therefore,
Well, I think
etc.
I think you have to be realistic about where we are. We're in a different situation than we were in 20 years ago. But that doesn't mean that just because TRAs bring up intersex conditions, that the existence of people with disorders of sex development are the reason that trans demands have moved forward. That's not the slippery, that I hear that slippery slope. Well, if we allow them, that's how this happened. That is not how this happened.
I think the opposite thing is at hand. Like now we need the laws because they have encroached, and so how do we deal with the people with the
Well,
disorder
I
of
think a
sexual
great
development? Because
starting point, and I haven't really thought through how you go about bringing a challenge, but there are some states that are allowing individuals to just change their identification. There's one person that I'm thinking of, I used to follow on Twitter, who announced gleefully the day that he got his new driver's license with an F on it. And I thought, well, F is right. What the F? Um, I, I would that that is a pretty clear challenge to women having rights if you can't even tell who's male or female now because you can just opt into a category.
well,
I think just make it not legal to change your sex on your documentation. The end.
right. That's what I was
And
going
if
to
it's
say.
not legal, a court can absolutely still do it if there is, a really important case for an individual with DSD who needs to have that changed for their own need. That's a totally different situation than literally some dude deciding, I like wearing women's clothing and I'd like people to refer to me as Julia now. I, I mean, what's your purpose for that? How does that stop? Change your
I
name if
really
you
feel like
want, but you can't change your sex on your driver's license or your birth certificate. I don't think
I
this
feel
that shouldn't be controversial, and it shouldn't be controversial for gender critical people. That should be something that we can all agree on.
I feel like you just sewed it shut because, like, to answer the question of what do we do now with like these challenges, the answer is you can't change the sex on your birth certificate. Like barring a
Yeah.
specific, and the law has always allowed this, but that's just the simplest answer. Like that 100% sews it shut, and that sews it shut with CAIS individuals, with the CAIS XY people in the female category. And
Well,
but that's just like the
and
cleanest.
then, there are other areas of law where we have to say, no, it's about sex. It's not about your gender identity. It is about your sex, period. And so, no, you know, Emily, you're not going to the lady jail just because uh, you've found your feminine side now that you've been incarcerated. I mean, the law in California is insane. Why? It's preposterous on its face that men especially men who are in for sex crimes, should be able to say, hey, no, wait, I'm really a woman. I can't imagine a circumstance. If I were a man, I can't imagine going to men's prison and not immediately going, put me in with the ladies. I've just now discovered my feminine side. I mean, come on. And so
I
it's those things, that and medically transing children, and a handful of other things, men in girls' sports. That's where we should be focusing our energy, not fighting internally over whether this particular person belongs to us or not. And that was another thing that I was a little irritated with. I'm a pretty feminist. I get in trouble sometimes for being more interested in telling Bible stories about girls than boys, or from promoting Girl Scouts over BSA or whatever they call themselves today. But men exist. I have a male son. I have a male husband. That's where some of my female children came from. And so to me, you just can't say, well, because they're male, that means they don't matter. We can't even have any discussion about whether or not they have needs because I've defined them as male.
And that's a whole separate, the conversation of separatism and like how men fit into
I feel
women's
like
rights.
it's a separatist argument. It says, because we've identified these CAIS people as male, we don't care about them, and that there's something wrong with you stupid women who are caring about them. And it's the same thing that separatists have been saying for, you know, many years, since before I was born, for sure, that, well, you're not as feminist as me because, you're sleeping with your oppressor. Well, I don't buy that. I don't believe that. I see where people get to that. I don't have a problem with them having that belief, but that belief is not going to be represented in U.S. law. That's not going
I
to be
think
the belief that's going to be effective, that's going to change the law and make lives better for women, broadly speaking.
I'm so happy, oh, lucky me. I just go my way, living every day. I don't worry, don't agree. Things that bother you never bother me. I'm right here to say when I'm old and grey, I'll be right in my prime. Living in the sunlight, loving in the moonlight, having a wonderful time.
I think we have an entire episode worth of content on the question of separatism and antinatalism, and I think that's worthy of an entire discussion.